democracy is under attack. Healthcare, voting rights, reproductive justice is under attack. Gender equality, fairness are under attack. Criminal justice is under attack. Attention, our democracy is under attack.
Good evening. I'm Anisha Hardy, the Executive Director for Alabama Values. We are a grassroots communications organization that leverages the power of media, culture, and visual storytelling to raise awareness around pro-democracy issues, values, and policies. Welcome to the second briefing under our Democracy Under Attack initiative, Empower the Vote, Unmasking Voter Suppression. Democracy Under Attack is an Alabama Values collaborative initiative with the Groundwork Project, the Southern Leadership for Voter Engagement, and Spotlight PR. Our goal is to amplify the collective attacks on democracy and connect community issues to people's front door. Historical milestones in the fight for voting rights have marked significant progress towards freedom, democracy, and representation. However, the fight for voting rights continues today. New challenges have emerged, threatening to undermine the progress made by launching discriminatory and unfair voter suppression tactics and policies. This evening, we will highlight the current fights for voting rights, confront the ongoing barriers, and explore strategies to empower the vote. I am excited to bring on my dear friend and co-moderator, Joe Kennedy, founder of Groundworks, and our panelists to guide us in this insightful and timely conversation. Joe and panel, you all take it away.
Anisha, you are just amazing. Thank you so much, and good evening and welcome, everybody. I am your co-moderator for this evening, Joe Kennedy, and I have the incredible honor of helping host tonight's Democracy Under Attack briefing, which is entitled Empower the Vote, Unmasking Voter Suppression. I'm going to be facilitating the first half of the discussion, which is, folks, we are in for a treat. But before we get into the meat of the discussion here, I want to start with a huge thank you to a phenomenal co-moderator, an absolute force of nature, and an incredible person, and Anisha Hardy from Alabama Values, for pulling this conversation together and for leading the way when it comes to creating a compelling, collective pro-democracy narrative across the South. Anisha, we are so honored to know you, to support you, and to be part of your work in some small way. Huge thank you to you. As Anisha mentioned, I am the founder of the Groundwork Project, which is a national organization that invests in community organizing in places that progressives have gotten used to writing off, just ignoring from the beginning. States like Alabama and Mississippi, states that we like to call the real battlegrounds, the places where the fight to democracy is being waged today, not off in the future, not a decade from now, but today. And it's where those fights will be won or lost. A few issues demonstrate this more clearly than the topic that we're here to discuss: voting suppression across the South. So joining me tonight are four extraordinary guests. We've got first a dedicated community organizer in Kiana Jackson from the New Disabled South, an insightful policy director, Dylan Nettles with the ACLU of Alabama, a passionate lawyer, legal scholar, and advisor to the Andrew Goodman Foundation, and Yael Bromberg, who's a sharp political activist, Jamal Watkins, a senior vice president of strategy and advancement for the NAACP, and finally, a very dear friend of mine, Charles Taylor, who's the executive director of the Mississippi NAACP, our Southern organizing advisor at the Groundwork Project. So to this incredible panel, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And before we dive into the conversation, I want to take a moment to get to know each one of our guests a little bit and to hear about some of the work that they're doing. So I'm going to ask you, somewhat dangerously, but for each of you to briefly share a bit on your background, your involvement in this effort across the South to fight for voting rights and democracy. And Dylan, it's away to you first.
Wow, putting me on the spot here first, Joe. This is might be the toughest question for me tonight. I don't like to talk about myself very much. My name is Dylan Nettles. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director here for the ACLU of Alabama, and I've actually been here with the ACLU for about 5 years now, but I've been community organizing as a native of Alabama since I was about 17 years old. This is the work that I'm passionate about. This is my state. This is where I have skin in the game. And it's my communities that are implicated by these threats to our democracy. Here, of course, at the ACLU, we center issues of voting rights, of reproductive freedom and justice, of our First Amendment speech and protest rights, which here in many of our states, we're having to rely on as they're slipping away more and more by the day. And so I'm looking forward to discussion tonight and being a part of this amazing group of panelists who are doing the work.
Dylan, thank you and well done. Kiana, over to you.
Hi, similar to Dylan, I hate talking about myself, but I am Kiana Jackson. I am the Research and Coalition Organizing Manager at New Disabled South. A little bit about me. I am from Albany, Georgia, so rural Southwest Georgia, right next door to Alabama. And I got started in community organizing with Black Voters Matter and also just in college in general. So really focusing on climate, environmental issues, voting rights, voting access in rural Black communities. But then also focusing on how do these issues intersect with the disabled community, and really looking at access in its totality and looking at how we work in how do we create sort of like a cross movement initiative to bring all of these issues to the table, particularly when it comes to voting and voting in the South, particularly in the rural South.
Kiana, thank you. It is a theme here that most of our panelists are going to hate talking about themselves, which is why we are asking you to talk about yourselves. So, Charles, you're next.
Hey, Joe, thank you for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation about democracy under attack. Live in Mississippi. Anybody knows me know I love Mississippi. Like you said, part of NAACP as well as groundwork. Excited for the conversation because I'll tell you what's happening in Mississippi is going to have effects all over the country. And so, happy to be here on the ground, happy to be a part of the conversation. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. And forgive me, I'm going on and off mute because I've got 2 little kids that are watching an electronic babysitter, otherwise known as a television, in the other room. So I'm trying to spare you, I think, Wild Kratts in the background soundtrack here. So sorry for the quick delay. Yael, over to you, please.
Hi, folks. I have my little ones in the background too. So my name is Yael Bromberg. I'm a constitutional rights attorney, and I teach election law and the political process at Rutgers Law. But I come to this work as a constitutional rights attorney, having been an organizer for decades, really. And so I look at these infringements, which I'm excited to speak with you all about, from the lens of how to meld organizing and advocacy with litigation and where it's appropriate to do which one, because it's not always the same solution depending on the issue. And I'm joining as special counsel and strategic advisor with the Andrew Goodman Foundation, which is an organization dedicated to making youth voices and votes a powerful force in democracy. We're in 24 states across over 80 campuses in the country. And of course, Andy is our legacy story who comes out of Mississippi following Freedom Summer 1964 and the assassination of the civil rights workers there. So it's really an honor for me to be joining all of you. I was just in Mississippi as well, and really nice to be able to join with all of you virtually in this space. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I appreciate the backup there with the kids. So thank you. Jamal, over to you to finish out the intros.
Well, thanks, Joe. It's actually good to see you. I don't know if you recall, we actually overlapped in undergrad.
Yes, we did.
When I was at Stanford on campus, I was the political action chair of the NAACP, a co-chair of the BSU, and I feel like my work and life has continued through my advocacy work in my undergrad days. And what's fascinating about being from the great state of California, most folks would say, oh, California is great. It's a liberal bastion. It's progressive. You don't have to worry about anything. But I'm from a city called Bakersfield, California. Now, I don't know if all of you know, but there is someone from Bakersfield, California, who is sitting in the halls of Congress, who is our current speaker, and may not fully represent all of the things that are about an inclusive democracy. So even being from a liberal state, if you will, like California, you learn very early on that there are progressive and conservative forces at play that are pushing and pulling at the heartstrings of America. And so for me, being a part of the NAACP and doing this work alongside leaders like Charles Taylor is really critical to advancing the right agenda.
Jamal, thank you. And it's great to see you again. And thank you, obviously, for your work from Massachusetts. I can testify to the fact that in progressive states, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are as progressive as people think, or that there aren't major areas of improvement that are necessary. So I want to jump right in here. And history has shown us that voter suppression comes in all sorts of different forms. It can be embedded in unfair policies, practices, and local legislation. And it seems like the opposition is always innovating. Recently, the Mississippi legislature passed a bill that would significantly increase state control over the city of Jackson's judicial system and its policing system. The measure puts a mostly white, conservative state officials in control of a city where more than 80% of the population of residents are Black, and it is a majority Democratic city. So, Charles, I'm hoping that you can speak a little bit about what happened in Jackson and how it might be used as a blueprint for similar voter suppression tactics targeted at Black voters in particular across the South.
Thank you, Joe. You know, it's interesting. Right now, I'm reflecting on a quote from Zora Neale Hurston, and she said that if you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. You know, as I think about that, I really think about voter suppression, because in Mississippi, sometimes it seems like it's a very difficult task to address. It also seems like, you know, sometimes we may or may not be getting the progress that we want, but we cannot be silent. And so, you know, one of the things that happened just today is that we were in federal court about this HB 1020, which is the piece of legislation that you referenced. You know, so we were having a hearing about that today. And so, you know, we will see how this plays out in federal court. But when it comes to voter suppression, there's things that the NAACP and other organizations in Mississippi, like One Voice, et cetera, has been doing. One, a lot of work around election protection. So for the last 2 decades or so, there's been a coalition of organizations in Mississippi that has looked at election protection. So every year, there's a hotline number that you can call, report the issues that you're having at the polling place in real time. And there's a panel of legal experts that, you know, will say one way or another whether or not it's something they can address immediately, something that they may want to address in court. But then also you can just call to say, hey, my polling location was changed, and can you give me the new address? We'll look up your location and do that for you. You know, but the reason why we're seeing so many voter suppression bills and so many you know, bills that really strike towards the right the right to vote in this country, particularly for Black folks, like you said, in Mississippi, is because progress has happened. And so, you know, progress is not just linear. You know, oftentimes what happens with that progress, because Mississippi is a state that has more Black elected officials than any other state in the country. You know, as I reflect on, you know, Medgar Evers, who was assassinated nearly 60 years to the date, you know, all of the work that he did and many others like Fannie Lou Hamer, in order for us to have Black elected officials, in order for us to have fair redistricting in Mississippi, and now to say, you know, there's over 1,000 people that look like me that are elected in a state like Mississippi. So saying that to say there's still work to be done, but with that, we're going to continue to fight, because as long as they weaponize the legislator against Black residents and against Black citizens in Mississippi, we're going to continue to fight against it. And as Derek Johnson, our national president, says often, when we fight, we win.
Charles, thanks, pal, and thanks for that, and giving everybody more details as to what's taking place in Jackson. And Dylan, almost not to be outdone, I want to come to you because we're speaking of conservative innovations in this space, and right now, Alabama, there's a new one. You guys are fighting a bill that would make it a felony to distribute absentee ballots, right? A felony to distribute.
Right.
We've seen similar legislation introduced across the South this legislative session. So talk to us about what this bill actually does, its community impact, and how the bill is rooted in voter suppression.
Thanks, Joe. I mean, of course, the panel theme tonight is democracy under attack, and there's really just no probably better embodiment of that type of activity happening. As Charles pointed out, the weaponization in our state legislature is happening right here in Alabama, just the same as it is in Mississippi. House Bill 209 is sponsored by Representative Jamie Keel. And as you pointed out, Joe, it would make it a felony for absentee ballot applications or absentee ballots to be distributed, ordered, requested, collected, completed, obtained, or delivered by a person that does not fall into a narrow group of individuals outlined by the law. And I'm going to break down what that narrow group of individuals is, but I want to emphasize two important pieces of what I just said. The absentee ballot applications or absentee ballots are criminalized for all of those things I listed: distributing, ordering, helping with. Those are, of course, two separate documents, right? Lots of folks don't even know in the first place that they have to apply for the absentee ballot to then receive it, right? And then many people need assistance or support to get that ballot filled out and delivered. And that's takes me to my second point, which is that the felony penalty is not just for the assistance with the absentee ballot, it's also for the assistance of going as far as delivering it. And that is I believe a Class C felony in the legislation, if I'm not mistaken. I pointed out that the law does, point out that there's so few communities or people within your community who can help out, but that is a very narrow group of individuals. You essentially have to be someone who works as an election official or works in the absentee election manager's office. You have to be a next of kin of that individual or someone who lives with them, right? And so I could not do it for my uncle. And if I did, by paying me to say, hey, thanks, Dylan, for taking time out of your day. I know, here's some gas money for you being willing to go drop off my absentee ballot. I could also be charged with a felony for doing that, of course, but he also could be charged with a felony for giving me that $10 in gas money to go up the street to deliver the ballot. This is what we're seeing happen at this stage in our state legislature, which is no stranger, of course, to rolling back and threatening voting rights. But even though we know absentee ballot voting is widely used by even Republican voters, which of course is the majority party in our state legislature, they're even willing to still go after this method of voting, which has been used in Alabama for decades. In fact, Alabama just during the pandemic saw its highest absentee voting turnout numbers because at that time, our previous Secretary of State made some exceptions under emergency declaration that allowed people to vote absentee in person, essentially. It's about actually the closest thing we've also gotten to no excuse absentee voting in Alabama, which the legislature also currently will not even advance legislation to permit in the state. We have no early voting. We have no excuse absentee voting as an option at all. Yet this is the type of bills criminalizing absentee voting assistance that the legislature is planning to advance. The bill has already passed the House chamber, and actually tomorrow, the Senate State Governmental Affairs Committee will consider HB 209 at 1:00 in its Senate committee meeting, which we will have a public hearing on. And I've got to say really quickly, Joe, I am here, and I think I'll get a chance to talk about this a little bit more later, but I'm here, of course, representing the ACLU of Alabama, but the advocacy and attention that Alabamians have been giving this, especially the Alabama Voting Rights Coalition, has been powerful. And it is probably the only reason that it's taken this bill this long to pass. Typically, this bill was filed early in the session. Typically, bills like this fly through, and we plan to fight it each and every step of the way.
Dylan, thank you. powerful testimony there, and hard to overstate the impact a bill like that could have, or what the intent behind it signifies. So obviously, thank you for your work and shining a spotlight on it. And Kiana, I want to bring it over to you. Dylan had mentioned the ways in which HB 209 will disproportionately impact elderly and disabled voters and folks that need help or would otherwise rely on volunteers, caseworkers, et cetera, to be able to exercise a fundamental right and the right to vote. There are also similar bills that are being debated across the South, specifically in Georgia and North Carolina, Florida, and Tennessee. And Tennessee actually has a law currently on the books that criminalizes giving an absentee ballot application form to another person, even in cases where the person requests it. And your organization, the New Disabled South, is dedicated to fighting for policies at the state and local level that help improve the lives of disabled people in the South, including voting. So I want to turn to you so that you can give us some idea of what the common barriers and challenges that disabled individuals face, people with disabilities, when it comes to voter registration and voting processes that some of the rest of us, if you're not open to or sensitive to some of those realities, you might not even realize.
Yeah, no, 100%. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about this, particularly when it comes to absentee balloting or voting by mail. We know that 51% of disabled voters vote by mail, and they do that because they are 3 times less likely to face barriers than they do when they're in person. These barriers could be polling location accessibility, right? So only 17% of polling locations in the United States can be considered fully accessible. And though that comes from communication barriers, lack of people who are able to communicate with deaf constituents, even not having accessible voting machines, or when they do, they're kind of like hid in a corner somewhere off in like the dark, further segregating disabled people from community. And then the fact that some of our national laws only require one of your polling booths to be accessible, when there are 20 million at least Americans that have some type of disability. And so all of these things combined means that when they are, a lot of times we look at these laws targeting absentee ballots and we look at, well, how is this affecting minority communities, right? But we know that disability is the largest minority group in the country. So we have to look at how is this not only affecting Black people, but how is this affecting Black disabled people, even in terms of registering to vote. Disabled people are about 10 to 15% less likely to be registered to vote than an able-bodied person. That's a huge gap. And we have to look at why does that exist, right? So now we have to start looking at what are the barriers to even voting or registering to vote. We know that only about 7.5% of disabled people are not able to have a voter ID, compared to able-bodied people is at 4%. So there are huge gaps in even how we vote. But then particularly when we talk about accessibility, and you're putting more and more barriers in place. I was one of the ones in Georgia, when Georgia passed the SB 202 bill. I just had a case back in February with the Secretary of State. They were trying to prosecute me for passing out water and snacks to people in line down here in Albany, Georgia. Because we have a high disabled population. We had people in line that were passing out. We had people that were having high blood pressure issues, diabetes issues. And so we were called to come and pass out water and snacks. And they're in bulletproof vests. We had a woman pull a gun on us back in 2020. So I was in one of the first big laws in Georgia, SB 202. I was a person who had to go before the state elections board and be questioned as a criminal, right? We were called all kinds of things for wanting to increase voter accessibility, particularly for disabled communities. And so all of these things combined, when you're continuously restricting the most popular, widely used, right, 51% of disabled people vote by mail, then we start to see an even bigger discrepancy when we start looking at Black disabled people.
That's just nuts, right? It's just nuts. Thank you for your work. Thank you for sharing that story, Kiana, and thank you for just persevering through that extraordinary amount of opposition and intimidation. Wow. Yael, I want to turn to you next. The legal battles that have been crucial in the fight against voter suppression, they have been crucial for a long time. They've also been weaponized now, obviously, back against that expansion of the franchise. But those cases have allowed us to challenge discriminatory laws, unconstitutional redistricting, and voter intimidation tactics. There are currently now 2 cases pending a ruling from the Supreme Court any day now. The Milligan case out of Alabama, where the plaintiffs say that the state violated the Voting Rights Act with the racially gerrymandered maps, and Moore v. Harper, which is a case that involves North Carolina lawmakers challenging state court review of federal congressional voting maps based on what should be a fringe and dangerous theory called the independent state legislature theory. So I want to ask you to speak about how this fight has played out in the courts, what those legal pathways are that exist around some of those recent attacks on voting rights. And if you can, I also find that the history of that Milligan case remarkable insofar as, if I remember correctly, and I don't want to get this part wrong, but I think it was ruled unanimously at a lower court by 3 Republican judges appointed by Trump in favor of the plaintiffs, Mr. Milligan. And yet it's still in danger and likely to get overturned in the Supreme Court. So walk us through this, please.
Sure, and thanks for the question. And I've just been reflecting also on the various remarks coming from our panelists about these various restrictions coming out from Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and these are a part of an orchestrated attack on the right to vote. They've always been a part of the orchestrated attack. They're not particularly new, right? After the first Reconstruction of the nation, we saw Jim Crow laws starting to be put into place. I don't need to talk to y'all, you're from the South, of what the realities of that looked like, as well as during the second Reconstruction, we saw massive expansions of the right to vote in response to political violence, seeking to restrict it, and also physical violence. And now we are potentially, we'll see if it's true, in the midst of a third Reconstruction, because we are seeing a renewed recommitment to voter infringements, despite, as my friend from Alabama, ACLU mentioned earlier, Dylan, renewed access, right? People are coming out to vote as a result of the 2020 election modernization, the proliferation of election modernization, expanded access to vote by mail, right? Expanded access to in-person early voting. The list really goes on. And as a result of that, we saw unprecedented participation in access to the ballot, including among young voters, which is really the population that I particularly specialize in, but across the board. And, you know, the courts, they've been there. It's the federal courts. I don't want to say that, I don't want to signal that hope is lost with the courts, right? Because there's a lot of dismay right now over the composition, particularly of the United States Supreme Court, given the importance of the matters that have still to come out in this term. I believe that I'm quoting Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Center, correctly. He recently said that I might be bungling it, but it's my bungle, not his. I think that he had said that out of the 7 out of the 8 last presidential elections, and this is not a partisan point, it's just a statistical point, that Democrats won the popular vote, yet the supermajority of the current US Supreme Court, 6 of the 9 seats, were appointed by Republicans. And so what does this mean about public confidence in our electorate when the judiciary is not necessarily reflective of the voters? And yet still I do have faith in the judiciary. And I have faith in a range of different tools in order to protect the judiciary and the other important arms of government, including the one that's driven and written by we the people. It was the federal bench that established that overturned separate but equal. It was the bench that established the right to a women's bodily autonomy and personal autonomy, that validated basic privacy questions and autonomy questions like interracial marriage, that invalidated slavery, right, despite prior terrible precedent. And so we see this rejuvenation, it's a cyclical process. And we also have hope also on the state level, right? On the state level, it was the state high court in Arkansas that unanimously invalidated the strict voter identification law there. And it was the state high court in North Carolina prior to the recent election, which changed the composition of the high court, that said that actually partisan gerrymandering is justiciable and it is unconstitutional, despite the prior ruling by the US Supreme Court. So a lot of hope still lays with the federal bench and the state bench, but it has to be determined and supported by we the people. And the only way to get there is through organizing, advocacy, and getting out the vote. As a result of the recent election in North Carolina, despite the strong prior rulings, the newly constituted bench has done what? It has recalled the question of partisan gerrymandering, right? It has recalled the question even from the US Supreme Court, challenging the independent state theory, a very radical concept that makes no sense and is not in the best interest of the judiciary. Nevertheless, we the people. So we have to continue to persevere in litigation. There is resolution that we can get from the courts, but that resolution will be gained if we continue to mobilize and educate the base and each other around what is happening. And I'll give you one simple illustration, which was in North Carolina. It was the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in North Carolina that responded to the omnibus monster law there, that did a series of terrible things that I cannot begin to list, about 20 of them, including cuts to the early voting period and slashing very popular pre-registration programs that registered 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in advance of turning 18. And the list goes on. It was the Fourth Circuit that invalidated the omnibus voter suppression law. And it was we the people that went, right? We went to the court. There were the NAACP, North Carolina NAACP was at the courthouse. There were thousands and thousands of people protesting in the streets to call attention to this. So I think that the question is, how do we mobilize the court of the judiciary to recognize voter suppression laws? That has to come through actually the nerdy part of research. The photo ID restrictions that were upheld by the court were done so because of a lack of statistical evidence at the time. They were novel concepts, and now we have the benefit of the evidence on our side. But it has to be, again, supported by all of us turning up when it matters. And even if we lose in the court in one level, in one decision, there's always the ability of appeal. And I'll quote Arthur Kenoy, who says that the real test is not whether or not we lose in the court, but the impact that it has on the movement and on the people. And that is really what will persevere with us here.
Thank you for that, Yael, and beautifully said. Excuse me, Jamal, I want to come to you next. And we know, obviously, the fight for voting rights is a collective fight. And it's not just taking place in the courts, but it's also taking place on the ground in our communities. At Groundwork, we believe that local organizing is, in fact, a real cornerstone to power building. And the NAACP has an extraordinary rich history of working to remove barriers of racial discrimination through that kind of advocacy, right? Door by door, block by block, person by person, through grassroots organizing and through real community engagement. So I was hoping that you could tell us, but you think some of the most effective ways that you've seen people's power being built on the ground in this fight for democracy protection and for our freedom.
You know, Joe, I would start off by saying that when we think about the current election infrastructure in this country, both voter registration laws and also voter jurisdictions, it is inherently suppressive. The fact that there are 10,000 plus voting jurisdictions that can have nuances and variations, and they don't all add up to common sense and practical means to make sure that the eligible voters are able to vote is inherently a suppressive approach to democracy. And so from an organizing perspective, we have been making sure that that is the starting point of the conversation. If you think about what Yael lifted up, COVID-19 was awful, but it led to some very pragmatic voting reforms that actually worked in our darkest hour. I was able to walk and vote in 2020 at a drop box nearly 200 yards from my home. I had friends in the state of Maryland who were able to print out their ballots, put them in envelopes, and drop them off at vote centers. And we had no-fault absentee and vote-by-mail expansion happen in many jurisdictions. And so if these things work during a crisis, during our darkest hour, during times where everything was uncertain, and as many conservatives would have said and have said, one of the most secure elections of our lifetime, think 2020 and in 2022 even, then why wouldn't we keep those same advancements, those same structures in place during times of quote unquote normalcy? It's because the agenda is partisan in many ways, and it's about keeping people out of the system, keeping people home, shutting out folks who would normally vote. And so as we think about the organizing opportunity, it's having pragmatic conversations. When we talk to parents, they don't want to have to drive past 2 polling places to drop off their kids, drive across town to go to work, and then hustle home to go to that one place where they can vote before 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. It's arbitrary. It makes no sense. And so I think the gains we've seen during COVID, although COVID itself has been an awful experience, has shown us that if we can find these types of reforms that are pragmatic and work during a time of crises, then why not do it when we're at a time of normalcy, if you will, and when things are not in a form of crises? And so, and we've had these debates and we've seen these debates. It can't be wet or dry at the same time. And so if these elections were secure and they made sense and they worked, then we should be advocating, fighting for them to be maintained. And that's why you see all of the voter suppression laws that are popping up, post 2020, because too many people showed up that would vote in different types of leaders. And so, again, the other side, being nonpartisan but not blind, has said, we're going to continue to suppress the vote. And I think that's where the tug of war and the battles and the fights on the ground really make sense for communities and community organizers and frontline folks by connecting it to the truth. And the truth is, everything we're experiencing is a form of suppression. So let's fight to open those doors and really keep the reforms that we've gained and to ensure that we're building a true inclusive democracy.
Well said. I mean, I have often remarked of to see the fact that in our Constitution there are, our Bill of Rights that say that that the right to vote shall essentially not be abridged, and yet we see all of these barriers being put up, whereby the Second Amendment says the well-regulated militia should be like, if they can put up that many obstructions to not abridging a right to vote, it is interesting that the right to bear arms is completely hands off, right? And the level of hypocrisy on that we see from some of the folks in charge, including some of those folks wearing robes on our courts, is awfully hard to stomach. But I clearly am not telling you all something that you don't already know. I am so grateful to all of you for having be able to share the space with you, and for your work and for your guidance and your engagement and all that you're doing and your incredibly thoughtful answers. I now get to pass the mic back over to Anisha to continue this conversation through our next set of questions. So Anisha, back over to you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much. You're going to be missed. I know you're going to head backstage and continue to listen to the dynamic conversation. And I was going to say, thank you, Jamal, for transitioning us. As Jamal said, the math isn't mathing. Why wouldn't we keep measures in place that work during, a crisis? Why wouldn't we keep those same measures in place? And the truth is, everything we're experiencing is a form of oppression. So I want to kick it over to you, Charles. The fight for voting rights has been an enduring struggle throughout history, driven by the belief that every citizen deserves an equal voice in shaping their democracy. From the movement, the women's suffrage movement, to the civil rights movement, fighting against racial discrimination, courageous individuals and communities have challenged these oppressive systems to expand the access to the ballot. What can we learn from the success and failures of past efforts to combat voter suppression in order to inform the present day strategies for safeguarding voting rights and promoting equitable access to the ballot today?
One thing I think about, and Anisha, thank you for the question, is that voting matters. In every election, voting matters. We were able to celebrate just recently Nancy Abuda, being confirmed to the 11th Circuit, appellate court, U.S. appellate court, and she is the first African American woman to serve in that circuit. I am excited that she was confirmed, and I'm also excited that she previously was a voting rights attorney. The way in which you get a voting rights attorney on the 11th Circuit is by, one, voting in leaders to the Senate that would be compelled to confirm someone like her, but then secondly, having a federal administration voting in, a president that would consider appointing such a incredible person to the 11th Circuit. That's not something our former president would have done. He would have done the opposite. But that's why voting matters. As I think about this battle of voter suppression, oftentimes this battle plays out in the courts, and it matters who is on the bench. And so one way that we can combat it, there are other federal courts that need to be filled with judges. Press upon this administration, press upon your senators that you want to have good, honest judges in those seats. That's one thing. Secondly, as I think about this, is making sure that you create a record. One of the ways that voter suppression gets to go unchecked is that, it's just hearsay. It's sometimes can feel like rumors in the night. But when you have concrete evidence, when you can say, we have identified so many people at this particular polling location that said, this is an issue, you can address that. You can create, a ledger for these things. And so this election protection matters. The third thing I'll say about it is thinking about this concept of voting again. All elections matter. Your election commissioners or whatever board that certifies your elections in these counties and cities, etc. Those individuals have a profound impact on what an election can look like. Jamal, I think, hit it on the head. You think about some of these practical things that happened during the pandemic in order to ensure folks voted. It was your local elected commissioners, your local elected folks who look at these offices. Those were the individuals who said, you know what, we need to change what it looks like for voting in order for more people to vote. Now, the reason why we need to make sure that we have some good folks in these offices, because as Jamal has stated previously, not everybody is excited about voting participation being higher than normal. Because usually when you have high voter registration, when you have high voter participation, it leans more progressive. That's just what we've seen as a national trend. And so voter suppression often ways is a tactic of winning for many folks who I would say is on the other side of the fence in this fight. So saying that to say, those are the three things I think about, as we move forward in this fight. One, it matters who sits on the bench. Two, we have to continue to protect our elections. And three, we have to make sure that the folks who are the gatekeepers of our local elections are good folks. I'll say this in conclusion. that the election commissioner races in many places often go unlooked, but they have a lot of power as to who is elected from president all the way down to dog catcher. So those are the three things I'm thinking about as we look at successes and failures of voter suppression, of combating voter suppression tactics.
Thank you, Charles, for that insight. I hear you. Create a record, get the receipts. Get judges in place that believe in fair maps and fair elections, and most importantly, vote like every election matters. And remember that politics is local. It's the local officials that impact what is happening at your front door. So thank you for making those points. Jamal, I'm going to come to you. Being a political strategist, I mean, you're strategizing around organizing, policy, incomes. I often say that narrative and messaging is critical to combating issues like this and building these equitable power structures as we rally and fight for freedom and democracy. And when we follow the narrative drumbeat around the anti-democratic and anti-voter, legislation being introduced across the country, particularly in the South, and we see lawmakers putting politics over people, we're seeing a highly polarized political landscape. What are the pathways, or what pathways, do you see that we have, or what strategies can be deployed to promote bipartisan collaboration and dialogue on, around voting rights, despite the highly polarized nature of the current political landscape?
My friend, I struggle with this narrative or framework of bipartisanship, in part because what we have seen is the polarizing of the country and the parties for individual gain. And I said earlier, we are nonpartisan as an organization, the NAACP, but we're not blind. And so we know that a governor like Ron DeSantis is using his bully pulpit and his policy pulpit to literally pass laws to make himself the other choice, if you will, for president, a kinder, gentler Donald Trump, if you will. And it's not even about the party at this point. It is literally about the politics of the individual. And so I would argue we want to go beyond bipartisanship and go back to people-centered politics. And that is making sure that we are not protecting just elections, we're protecting voters, that we're not actually fighting for policy change theoretically because the Constitution says so, but because it is a fundamental premise of our democracy, whether the Constitution is fully realized or not. And so I would argue, and you said something very important about this, is that if we don't change the narrative to get back to the people, if 70% plus of people, as Jael lifted up, voted in a progressive way during the presidential cycle over multiple presidential cycles, why aren't those people's voices being heard? Why aren't those elected officials that should represent those voices in the halls of Congress, in the seats of power? And I think we have given too much, I would argue, to the political parties. And I'm going to say something that may be a little controversial, but political parties be damned if we're not focusing in on organizing and investing in what's best for community. Because I spent a little bit of time, and I'll close with this. We were, I think, in Alabama a few weeks ago for a convening. And I saw that the first, Confederate White House was still being funded by the state, and children were being taken to that location on field trips. And right around the corner was a museum for Rosa Parks, and right down the street is a museum for lynchings. And it doesn't make sense. And so we have to make sure, and you said this earlier, that the math is mathing. And so I would argue when the political parties fail us, whether it's Republican or Democrat, we have to kick all of those jokers out and vote for the right individuals who are going to put the policies for the people first. It sounds very Pollyanna-ish and very hokey, but if we don't get back to that, I think the verge of chaos that we saw on January 6th can happen again, because we're putting individual politicians in some sort of pedestal or on a pedestal when it's not about them. It's about the everyday working people, men, women, children, families who are in community trying to survive.
Thank you for those comments. And, and I was born and raised in Montgomery, Alabama. And I often said, with it being the home of the civil rights movement on one hand and one of the cradles of the Confederacy on the other hand, that dichotomy in itself gives you a unique vantage point in what we're seeing happening across the country. So just even making that point, as goes the South, so goes the nation. And we've seen what the South looked like, during the civil rights movement, during the liberation period, how that impacted the country. And we're seeing what the South looks like during this time of oppression. So thank you for making that comment. Yael, so let's talk about, voter suppression laws, can have significant long-term consequences on freedom and democracy. These laws which aim to restrict or hinder certain communities from exercising their right to vote. These laws that dilute the power of people's votes or chip away at the protection provided by current voting rights legislation can undermine the principles of fairness and inclusivity and equal representation in the electoral process. Like, what do you see as some of the potential long-term consequences of voter suppression laws on representation and democracy? And how might these laws shape future elections and political dynamics?
Thank you for the question, Anisha. And again, I appreciate being in conversation with all these panelists. I just trying not to nod my head too much over here. Well, exactly. Well, these elections have real consequences, right? And unfortunately, when a court allows a voter suppression law to proceed and does not grant a preliminary injunction, we have elections being put into place and being held with restrictive laws in place, even where those restrictive laws end up being overturned and found unconstitutional in the future. And so what does that mean about the composition of a legislature where 5 years earlier, a voter ID law was put into place, which was later found to be intentionally discriminatory, which was the case that took place in Texas, for example, when a strict voter identification law was introduced in 2011, and 5 years of elections took place with that law in place, which was later overturned by the Fifth Circuit, not a liberal court, Court of Appeals, upholding and directing the district court to find similarly, right? So in that case, for example, a strict voter ID law was introduced in 2011, and it found that the expert evidence in the case found that 600,000 new registrants would be impacted by this voter identification law, right? And in the meantime, you have critical elections taking place, right, with that law in place, such as, just as one example, the 2014 gubernatorial election, where then Texas Senator Wendy Davis was running against elected Greg Abbott, who has now ushered in multiple restrictive laws, which continue to be overturned, that clog our federal judiciary. And when they are shut down, it is the taxpayers that have to pay for them. So what do the voter suppressionists say? They claim that they support these laws for the idea of election integrity and installing the public confidence in the electoral system. And we need to reclaim that narrative, because public confidence and election integrity in our voter system is found when we look at election modernization tools like we discussed earlier, and increased voting rights. When people are coming out to vote at increased voting rates, we have increased participation, and we have increased trust in the electoral system, and increased trust in the legislators who we elected to fairly represent us. And I'll give you another example of how the maths. So going back to this question on the county level, the county decisions are so critical because they're the ones administering and counting the vote by mail ballots. I focus, like I said earlier, on youth voters. I'm a national leading scholar on the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age to 18 and outlaws age discrimination with regard to ballot access. I always have to tell people what it is, because even though it's the most recent voting rights amendment to be ratified, no one knows, because it's just a kind of an atrophying muscle. So I want to strengthen that muscle. So in Florida, there was a statewide ban on the availability of polling locations on campuses during the early voting period. The Andrew Goodman Foundation, the League of Women Voters of Florida, fought that on 26th Amendment grounds. And a federal judge in Florida agreed with us that that was a violation of the 26th Amendment. You cannot ban the availability of polling locations on college campuses. After we secured that overturn of law, we quantified, we did the math. And in the 2018 race, the judge issued the preliminary injunction August 2018. The race, the midterm election was held that November, right? 12 college campuses brought the measure on campus in about 2 months when they were available to designate. We did the math. 60,000 people availed themselves of this new expanded mechanism, which was novel at the time. So taken out of context, you don't really know what that 60,000 means. In the senatorial race, that election, it was decided by 10,000 votes. The gubernatorial race, that election, was decided by half the number of voters that availed themselves of the mechanism, 30,000 votes. Can you imagine what our elected representatives would look like in Florida today if that measure was not simply passed to put into place on 9 campuses and was spread across the country, across the state, right? What would access and freedom of education look like if our elected representatives looked like us and reflected our values? So that question about the local election results, right? If you look at the treatment of vote by mail ballots in Florida, vote by mail ballots cast by young voters, they are rejected at a higher rate than any other age cohort and any other protected class of voters. The vote by mail ballots, why? There's increased mobility of young voters, et cetera, right? Change of residences at a higher rate, not updating, lots of voter confusion, lack of information, et cetera. If we were to bring polling locations on campuses, which, by the way, going to Kiana's point, tend to be ADA accessible because they're required to be ADA accessible, right? Then we would be expanding a key electoral mechanism to a constitutionally protected class of voters pursuant to the 26th Amendment. So these common sense mechanisms, we know the solutions, right? We just need to work together to get there. And then we'll have a much more reflected legislature because we actually elected them into office. And again, this is not about partisanship. We need a more reflective legislature at all levels and across all political parties.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for making those points. Kiana, I want to kick it to you. Typically when we hear discussions around combating voter suppression, tactics, the discussion often centers around race and partisanship. As you may find in your day-to-day organizing work, voter suppression can have a significant impact on the disabled community, exacerbating, as you mentioned, existing barriers and hindering their ability to exercise their right to vote. In efforts to address voter suppression, they must be intentional and consider the specific needs and barriers faced by the disabled community, without a doubt. What are some policy measures and organizing efforts, do you see as being critical to ensuring that the disabled community and disabled individuals can fully exercise their right to vote and participate in the democratic process?
Thank you for that question. I would say that in general, what we saw in 2020 was voting was just accessible. And when you center accessibility, when you center disabled people, and you center what makes it easy for disabled people to vote, it makes it easier for everyone to vote. And we saw that in 2020. Because voting, I always say voting should be the easiest thing that any person living in this country is able to do. It should be as easy as getting up out of your bed in the morning. And instead, what we see is this steady increase, and the other panelists brought it up, is we're consistently trying to make it harder for people to do that. And so I think that in terms of organizing, focusing on it in 2 different ways, right? So in organizing ways, making sure that even our organizing is accessible. A lot of times when we are out in community and people are, and I'm taking organizing seriously, right? Because a lot of times we're like, oh, what can the government do? But they just ain't gonna do it. All right, they have no incentive to do anything to help anyone. A lot of the push comes from us as organizers, as nonprofits working in these communities. How are we accessible in the work that we're doing? How are we actively reaching out to disabled voters and not creating like a special task force to tackle disabled people, but actually incorporating that and integrating that into what we do and how we work and how we operate, making sure that we are including disabled people in outreach and in strategy for outreach to disabled people. A lot of times, as a disabled person myself, I've sat at tables and everyone's talking about this amazing disability strategy they have to do outreach to disabled people. And I'm like, hey, my first time hearing about it, I'm the only disabled person here. So it's like making sure that you are actually hearing from disabled people and not trying to be so prescriptive and like, oh, I have this amazing idea for this disabled constituency. In terms of policy, making sure that we are consistently changing the narrative around disability is a key component of this. A lot of times what we see with disabled people is a lot of people we like to speak for disabled people and not let disabled people use their own voices. Disabled people can communicate. Disabled people know what we need. We know what we want. We know what our community needs to change in order to be better represented and better involved in civic engagement. And so making sure that disabled people are going to the Capitol with you to talk about what is this measure that you're passing? How is that going to affect disabled people? Not just disabled people voting participation increased by 6 points in 2020. That outpaced non-disabled people. So voting was accessible. We need to be talking to disabled people about what was it, what ways did you do that? You need to be the one going to the Capitol, talking to your legislators, saying, this made my life just a little bit easier. I was able to go and say who I want to represent me. And so policy changes, right? Increasing voting access. We need curbside voting accessibility. People need to be able to drive up and drop off their ballot and go on about their day and not have to prove that they're disabled, because that's also a thing. We need to have voter registration in itself is the whole conversation around just racism and ableism, the fact that you have to register to vote, but making sure that needs to be as accessible as possible, making sure that our better enforcement of WCAG, which is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, on your websites, making sure that disabled people can actually access information. And we need to be doing that in our organizing as well, making sure anything that we're publishing is accessible to disabled people and not just one type of disability, but all disabilities, making sure that we're testing our messaging across all of these, across all communities. And so those are the ways I think, as far as policy things we need to be pushing, but also what we need to be incorporating into our organizing measures as well, especially as people who are almost kind of a face and a voice for a lot of our communities.
Thank you. Thank you for making those points. We have one more question, and then we're going to go into our Q&A. I see we have a few questions, so we'll bring your questions on the screen and let our panelists answer. But before we do that, Dylan, my movement partner. History has taught us that there is power in the collective, and I walk in spaces, and that's my mood. Right? Collective power. Coalition work is a powerful strategy for combating voter suppression. By uniting diverse organizations and communities, coalitions can amplify community voices, leverage, shared resources, coordinate efforts, and collectively advocate for policies and practices that protect and expand access to the ballot. The ACLU of Alabama is part of the Alabama Voting Rights Coalition, which is made up of voting rights organizers, policy advocates, comms and media orgs. The coalition has been doing some powerful work around raising awareness and mobilizing communities around HB 209, the bill that you spoke about earlier, that will make it a felony to distribute absentee ballots. But can you talk about the power of coalition work and how policy, comms, and organizing each plays a role in defeating what we call bad legislations, and also promoting good legislation? What have you seen through the work that you've been doing with the coalition?
Yeah, Anisha, I am more than happy to brag on the Voting Rights Coalition. You probably heard me earlier, even ready to jump the gun and get out there and talk about it, because it is powerful and it's been really transformative to see it here in our home state of Alabama. Anisha mentioned earlier, she's from Montgomery, Alabama. I've lived here for the last 8 years, right? This is the birthplace of the civil rights movement. And what we're so fortunate to enjoy being a part of this community is that we have movement elders who are still alive and well with us. We have folks who are still able to lend and offer us those insights and that perspective. And what we've heard, and I know we've all heard this time and time again, is it has to be about the collective. It has to be about growing collective power. And it's not about any individual organization, certainly about no individual, despite how history has tried to center certain leaders and not to diminish their impact by any means. But we know that these are folks who had many, many people behind them, pushing them, like so many of us I know on this call do currently. The work that we've been doing with the Alabama Voting Rights Coalition, Anisha mentioned earlier that we're a statewide coalition of civic engagement and arts organizations, policy and legal organizations. But I also want to mention, I think it's really important to emphasize that we are also made up of grassroots advocates, and that's been an intentional decision in how we've steered and tried to lead this coalition, is to make sure that it is inclusive, to make sure that we are also talking about voting rights issues as voting rights advocates at the intersections of all of the other issues that we know are also tied up and tethered to our voting rights advocacy, criminal justice reform, immigration. Of course, Kiana just schooled us beautifully, eloquently about the need to center and make sure that disability rights advocates are also part of the conversation. And really echoing back to even the questions about kind of the lessons that we've learned, successes and failures of the movement before us, right? We know that we have to make sure that our spaces, our coalitions are inclusive and equitable, that we are inviting a diverse range of people to the table, but also, as Kiana said, not just inviting them to the table, but making sure they have a voice and making sure that they're centered and making sure that the most vulnerable people at that table, in fact, are having their priorities uplifted, because so often we know that when they are uplifted, then we all will see our rights safeguarded and advanced as a result. One of the things I also though want to be honest about, and I think history tells us this as well, but just put it out there, is, coalition work is not an easy feat. And I'm so fortunate to have a movement partner like Anisha and her staff, both at Alabama Values and sister organization, Alabama Values Progress, and so many more organizations. I won't even attempt to name them all. I want to get myself in any trouble for trying to name anybody and leave people out, but they know I love them all. And, corralling, convening, pulling people together to build consensus about these issues that we're seeing show up in our communities day in and day out, that we're all confronting from our different vantage points, is a difficult, challenge and task to take on. I've been fortunate to be a part of this leadership with the Alabama Voting Rights Coalition, but it's really because I'm listening and taking in what folks who are on the ground confronting these issues every day are saying, and how they're really showing up in people's lived experiences on a day-to-day. And I think, often in this work, we feel rushed and we're responding to urgent, what really are pressing issues, fires that we want to put out then and there. But coalition work also requires us to practice slowness and patience and be very calculated and deliberate in our movements. The Voting Rights Coalition has certainly affirmed that for me. And, as we've tried to strategize and think about our big comprehensive plan, we have communications folks and we have organizers and we have policy and legal folks, but we're really still working from one comprehensive strategy, which is that we are all having to do our part from our different vantage points and different sectors of the work to grow and build a coalition that can actually have the collective power that is going to safeguard and advance Alabamians' voting rights. And that will not be done unless we bring in folks at all of the edges, folks who don't get to the table, people who don't often get the information. We have to give folks the tools to not just say, okay, you know what to go back into your community and say or do, but actually, I know what now I need to do the next time this comes around. It feels like muscle memory almost, because we're going to continue to see these challenges. That's the reality of probably these next few years. But we want to grow our skills. We want to grow our communities in ways that they feel that they have the tools in hand, the lessons learned, like we all have to do as organizers, to begin to meet these challenges early and meet them exactly where they are. And so often, I think someone said this earlier, it starts at such the local level. It's sometimes even before we see it in the state legislature. We need those watchdogs and those community members who are trained up and prepared in every part of our community up and down the state.
Thank you. Thank you. And at this time, we're going to go into we're going to switch gears into our Q&A questions session. Just remind everyone, if you have any questions, please drop them in whatever chat section or comment section on platform that you're watching in, and we'll be able to grab it. So we're going to kick off with our first question. And it is from Jackson Sharp. And so Mississippi's HB 1020, which creates a new judicial system for Jackson, has been likened to a form of modern apartheid. Oh, yeah, I agree. I'm curious how this will affect litigating elections issues and voter suppression in the city. Is Jackson more susceptible to these issues now? Charles, without a doubt, this question is for you.
Yeah, and thank you for the question, Jackson. It's interesting when they created the CCID, the Capital Complex Improvement District. They basically did it so they could pave roads, and then they took that same district, weaponized it, and say expand Capitol Police. And then now this legislative session, they're saying they're creating a new judicial district. The implications of that district we are yet to know and understand. One big question I have is because you have, elected judges in Hinds County who would also still have jurisdiction in that district. So what happens when in that case? That's just a personal question I have. The second thing I would say is that we're battling it in a federal court, so I hope that it doesn't ever come into effect. But what happens with this is it's a lot more questions than answers that we have, and so. It won't necessarily affect that court won't be able to necessarily affect voter suppression issues necessarily, but the cases that they would be able to take up, et cetera, is still out there. And I'll be honest with you, I think it's bad legislation, but I also think it was legislation that left a lot to be desired.
Thank you. Thank you. And our next question is from Brian Hager. And Brian wants to know, have we become too reliant on litigation to stop suppression? Should we be more focused on elections and other, amendments in legislation? Referendums, in legislation.
I'll jump in and say, I would argue that we need to pull every single change lever possible in order to ensure that we are protecting voters. And so litigation is a key part of that, but you also have research by just finding the right data points to make sure that we are lifting up the right frameworks. And when Kiana talked about the differently able community increasing their vote share by 6%, that is a data point that is talkable and realistic that then says, let's center accessibility. But then you also have other change levers like convenings, trainings, storytelling through communications, mobilization, policy advocacy. All of those wraparounds have to be used, and I don't think we have to leave anything on the table. So litigation is one track. That's a strategy, but there are many others. And if we pull on all of those change levers, just like the other side, then we have a fighting chance of getting what we need done.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, and let's see, I think we have like two more questions, maybe. The next question, Porsche, if HB 209 does pass, if this does pass, what can we do?
That's an unfortunate question, one I don't want to think about, but of course, really have to, especially as we enter this this week with this bill on the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee tomorrow. What I will say is, it kind of echoes even to the last question. Litigation is certainly on the table, and that's something that we really do have to consider. And I say that because as an organizer who believes it always has to be a both and approach, it can't be an either or. And I've been critical myself and skeptical of how much we rely on litigation, even at the ACLU, right? But that being said, if this bill passes, we will sue. That's just got to be the case, right? At the same time, right, I would encourage you, Porsche, to join us in our efforts, whether it be with the Voting Rights Coalition. Also, we're doing election protection work here in Alabama as well. Fortunate to have so many of the partners who are part of the Voting Rights Coalition, a part of those efforts too. We get out and we need to recruit people who are going to monitor the polls. We also are going to be looking into some recruitment for poll workers, even people to go and actually get the training, not necessarily from the ACLU, but specifically from their county election officials and state offices to actually be able to work the polls, as well as people who are invested in saving and securing our democracy. We need good poll workers, and our election officials need people to help them. We also are looking into, as we are approaching the anniversary of the Shelby decision, as we're also waiting the Milligan decision, we're going to be having, I know, Alabama Values and Alabama Values Progress, Alabama Forward. So many organizations in the ACLU are looking at ways of uplifting what's going to be a part of this next decade of our fight for the voting rights in Alabama as the anniversary rolls around. And I think you'll be hearing more about those events in just the next couple of weeks.
Yes, thank you. Let's see. Jamal said sue everybody. That's a shirt, Jamal. That's the season. Sue everybody. Just walk in the room suing everybody. But let's go to our next question. Let's see. The current Alabama House Bill 401 may still pass this legislative session. It takes effect 3 months later. What is the process for protecting community members who exercise their First Amendment for pride? And I am looking it up.
I was going to say, I think this one's for me.
Information about it. Well, go ahead.
I was just going to mention just really quickly on this bill. Fortunately, Robert, I believe, asked this question. HB 401, it has not even moved. It has not been gone to a committee. It has not certainly come to the floor in the House or the Senate. And so it's really not a bill right now that I think it's an upsetting, offensive bill, of course, but I don't think it's one you should be worried about passing this legislative session. The bill, frankly, hasn't moved at this point. It won't have time to with the days we have left in the legislative session. So that's one that I will say you could probably take off of your list of concerns, but it's one we should keep an eye on because these bills do come back time and time again.
Yes. Let's see. And I think this is our last question. And this is coming from Kenneth. How do we engage our youth, to know their vote matters and mobilize them to make change in our communities when their parents and grandparents have been oppressed for so long? And Kenneth, I like that question. I often say that we have a generation that has a very punctuated relationship with voting and civic participation, whereas you have a generation, a group that from the time they were born, white folks from the time they were born in this country, they've always had the right. So they have a very linear relationship. So I think your question is spot on, and I would love to put that, out to the panel and multiple people can answer. But yeah, how do we engage, the youth when generationally, that hasn't been passed down as something of value?
I'll jump in here since I do so much work with young people across the country, and please, everyone else, feel free to join. I'm sure I'll miss something because it's actually a really big question. Young people, as you point out, Anisha, they haven't exercised their right to vote yet, right? So independent of what the prior generations in their household might have experienced, even if they were voting and participating, et cetera, young people still have substantial obstacles to overcome. Just like when you learn how to do something for the first time, there's information burdens and information obstacles. And so even under the best of circumstances, there are issues that we need to work together to engage young people in voter access. And usually the best way to start the conversation is, what do you care about, right? And I actually learned that the young people, they always school me. So I look at them, right? And if it's gun control and public safety, which is a huge concern for young people right now, climate justice and protecting the fight for our future to have an equitable and sustainable future, access to bodily autonomy concerns, et cetera. These are all things that are front and center for young people that they care about. And when their votes, when those rights are under attack, they do come out to vote. When abortion is on the referendum for statewide, youth voter rates increase. Young women, they come out to vote, right? So we see a track with regard to the issues and the attractiveness of the candidates with young people participating. And this is kind of one of those, all tactics are on the table for youth participation, right? We need to engage with pre-registration of high school youth. We need to encourage same-day registration and election day registration so that when they are highly mobile, they can easily re-register. We need polling locations on campuses for young people that want to continue on to higher education, but that needs to include also our community campuses, our two-year institutions, and our technical colleges. And the list really goes on. We have to study the treatment of their provisional ballots, because just like I said earlier, where their VBMs, the vote by mail ballots, are rejected at outsized rates, the same is true, unfortunately, for their provisional ballots, more than any other age cohort and more than any other protected class, constitutionally protected class. So, but the best way to engage them is to meet them where they're at, to talk to them about the issues and making sure criminal justice reform, right? You're electing the DAs. Who's electing the DAs? So we have to talk to them and lead with the issues. And the other thing is that we have to make participation fun. Just like we talked about earlier about there's all these different areas of social levers for change. All of these are accessible. It is not just a litigation approach, right? Every person can be engaged, right? You can be an artist and you can engage. You can go and get 10 neighbors and make sure, 10 classmates and make sure that they participate. We need the artists involved, right? We need everyone involved in this. That's what we learned from history. And that's where we see really successful efforts, is not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion and amongst each other. And the youth, I mean, they're really leading the way. And I see a lot of hope and inspiration. And the thing that I find with regard to youth voters in particular is that they eschew partisan affiliations, right? They vote independently, they vote with their issues, and they do come out and vote. We need to encourage them and knock down the boundaries, even the ones that we don't conceive of boundaries, because we don't conceive of them as a protected class of voters, but they actually very much are.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would just add that, you know, part of the equation is we have to get out of the way. Like, I sometimes consider myself to be a youth, but I know I'm not. And so for the NAACP, we have a youth and college division that has over 800 youth councils, folks under 18, college chapters, young adult councils, young adult chapters, individuals who are actually young people who are leading on their own without an adult, if you will. Many of them are adults trying to tell them what to do. And so I think part of it is, if we're going to do the right thing, is you have to center young people to be their own voice and to lead and empower them and get out of the way, especially when it comes to intergenerational organizing.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, go ahead, Charles. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say quickly, it's also an issue of stability. The reality of it is, the more stable you are in your life, the more likely you are to vote. And so young people are not stable. I mean, in the sense of when you know, the first time you vote, you're 18, so you transition from high school into career, into college, et cetera. 4 years later, you maybe transition to a new job, you transition into college. So with that, there's not as much stability versus somebody who's been living in the same house for 30 years and been paying a mortgage. And so when we talk about youth engagement, we have to create a level of stability for them as we do this. And, you know, to Jamal's point, nobody else can talk about, you know, what that stability look like more than the youth themselves. So allow them to be the decision makers.
Thank you. Thank you for that point. We got one more question that just came in, and it's from Katricia. How can blind people work to make sure the automark, make sure they automark voting machines? I think that's what's been said here. Ask here.
So one thing that we know is, I guess that'll be for me. I think one thing that we have to make sure is that when we are testing accessibility of voting machines, is making sure that these are tested by the communities that are going to be using these voting machines. A lot of times what we see is that people will go and put an accessibility little marker on their things, and they're like, okay, this makes this accessible, which arguably those make things very inaccessible, the accessibility markers. But a lot of the tests that are ran on these machines are not tested by people in the blind or low vision community. So the only thing that we can do to improve that is to make sure that we are making the builders of these machines, making sure that they are testing them on through multiple screen readers, multiple accessibility features to find the very best one. And that's it's something we call a universal design. So making sure at the onset, right before we even put this out, we're not putting the onus on the voter to figure out how to use it, but making sure it's usable before you even put it out into the market. So it's really pushing the makers of these machines to make your accessibility features, making sure they're actually accessible and usable to the people that are going to be using them. And then making sure that our polling locations and our poll workers are aware enough and are trained to spot these issues and to know what to do and have backups when people encounter these. So if a person comes to a machine and that machine is not usable or it's not accessible to them, making sure that we have polling staff that is trained in accessibility that can help them do a provisional ballot, walk them through what that looks like, and also have Braille materials. That's something that polling locations don't tend to have. Having Braille hard copy materials in case your machines aren't working.
Thank you. Thank you. And for those of our viewers that are still watching, thank you for tuning in. And if we could just give our panelists a virtual round of applause. Thank you, Dylan Nettles, again, Policy Director with the ACLU of Alabama, Yael Broomberg, lawyer, legal scholar, and advisor to the Andrew Goodman Foundation, Jamal Watkins, Senior VP of Strategy and Advancement for the NAACP, and Charles Taylor, Executive Director of the Mississippi NAACP and the Southern Organizing Advisor at Groundwork. And as we've shared here this evening, the fight for voting rights requires a multifaceted approach, that combines the grassroots mobilization, legal advocacy, education, and policy reform. Organizations and activists across the country, such as the ones that are represented here today, are working tirelessly to combat voter suppression, raise awareness about the importance of voting, and to promote inclusive electoral systems and processes. They champion the principles of inclusivity, equity, and representation, recognizing that democracy is strongest when everyone has an equal opportunity to participate. So just thank you from the bottom of my heart for all the work that you do in fighting for voting rights and freedom and democracy. Peace.
Attention, our democracy